Good morning. My name is Gareth Aiden, and I'm here for the Nashville Bar Association's Historical Committee. It's our honor this morning to be talking with Judge Hamilton Gayden about his distinguished career in practice and the many years he was a judge here in Davidson County. Kip, good morning.
Good morning, Gareth.
Just to begin with, as I understand it, to when you retired, you were the longest sitting judge in Tennessee. Is that correct?
I can't say that for sure, but that's the story I get. I know I'm the longest sitting judge in Davidson County, but there hasn't been any research as to statewide. If you count general sessions, I do know there was a Judge Evelyn, a friend of mine from East Tennessee, and he was a judge a lot longer than anybody I know in 50 some years. Mine was 47 years, and I beat him on the circuit bench. He was a general sessions judge for several years. So that's debatable, but I'll claim it.
Well, it's quite an honor and quite a feat, to tell you the truth. It means that there's a lot for us to discuss about your history with the courts and the bar. Could you give us your full name, please, sir?
Hamilton Virgil Gayden Jr.
And your birthday, please.
June 17, 1939.
Was that here in Nashville?
I was born in St. Thomas.
Tell us a little bit about your family, your father, and who he was and what he did, and then your mother also.
Well, my father was a physician here in town. He was an OBGYN. And speaking of records, for a long time, they say he did hold the record on births. He was a doctor adjunct to St. Thomas during his early years. Delivered a lot of kids. It helped me in politics later on. He was from Texas. He graduated from Vanderbilt Medical School. He had two brothers, both of them from Texas, and they both came to Nashville. One was a urologist here, and one was a urologist in Montgomery, Alabama. So I come from a medical family.
What was your father's name?
Hamilton Gayden.
Okay. And then your mom. Tell us about her and who she was.
My mother was a Nashvilleian. Unlike my father, she came from a historical family, but my father was from Texas, and he didn't like to hear about that. But I did listen to it within 1 year. Her name was Ann Dickinson, and her grandfather was Secretary of War under the Taft administration. Her great-great-grandfather helped write the Constitution of the United States, General James White. So had a lot of history in that family. John Overton, Felix Grundy, all of them descendants from my mother, and I guess me too. So I enjoyed hearing that part of it.
How did they meet?
He was at Vanderbilt Medical School, and he met, I'm not sure the location, but he met her here and stayed here.
Your mom and your dad are both now passed away.
Yeah.
How about the rest of your immediate family? Tell us about your brothers and your sister and their names and what they're doing.
Well, there were 6 of us. There are 3 of us that have now survived. My older brother, Dick, has passed away about 10 years ago. And then the brother underneath me is named Mac, short for McGavock, and he's in the music business and co-wrote the 20th most sung and recorded song in history called Everlasting Love. It actually was featured in the movie Ireland or Belfast.
My goodness.
So he's quite famous. Then a brother underneath him is Joe, who also survived, and he's a sculptor, and he lives in Dixon County. My sister Ida, who survives, lives in Florida. She graduated from Miami and the University of Tennessee Business School. So that's about it. Yeah. My brother Jack, Dr. John Gay, passed away about 4 years ago.
And I knew Jack.
And he was from Memphis.
Yes.
And,
Yes. Well, where was your family home growing up?
It was on Franklin Road, which was the Franklin Road in Woodbine at that time. Is now part of the over interstate drive, but the house is still there on the hill. Franklin Road. We were Franklin Roaders. Went to Robertson Academy.
That was for grade school.
Yeah.
And then where did you go after Robertson Academy?
I went to New York State, a private school called Storm King, a preparatory school from 7th to 8th and freshman year.
What was that like?
It was like, I actually have to say, I learned more 3 years in New York State and traveling to New England during the summers and off times. And I did in 7 years at Vanderbilt. It was a great education, something I appreciate. I try to get that with my sons, both my sons. One went to Europe for a year as an exchange student. I like traveling. That's where I learned a lot.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I had the same experience of having a few years at a top-notch school, and it made all the difference in my life. After you went to prep school in New York, what did you do 10th through the 12th grades?
I came back in half my sophomore year to Battleground Academy in Franklin.
And tell us about BGA.
BGA was a great school. It's back then you rode a bus or hitchhike all the way from Woodmont and Thompson Lane to school. It was a great education, but it was a long way. I drive that way often now, and I wonder how we ever did that, but that's what we did.
Did you actually have some days when you hitchhiked to school?
Many days.
Is that right?
Back in that day, I even hitchhiked across the United States twice to California.
Well, back in those days, you could do that safely. It was
Now
a
it's very
different
dangerous.
environment. Wow. Did you play sports at BGA?
Yeah, I played basketball. I learned to play basketball up at Storm King in New York. And I was eligible in my junior year, and I played on B team, undefeated. Then my senior year, I played on a basketball team. I was only 16 at the time, and made all region. And as a result of that, I got a half basketball scholarship at Vanderbilt.
Wow. And I noticed that doing a little research, getting ready for today, that you were on the Battleground Academy Hall of Fame. So evidently either sports or scholarship got you there. Maybe it was your career in the law.
Well, I'm sure it's sports. It could have been a scholarship because my senior year, the last half of my senior year, I decided I better make some grades to get into Vanderbilt. But if you go back earlier, I wasn't a big good student. I was more interested in playing basketball.
What did you do during the summer during school?
During those schools and during college, I've done a little bit of everything. Carpenter's helper, clerk for Ryder Truck Rental one time, sack grocery for Logan Supermarket. I worked at Apple Orchard down on Hillside Road during some of those summers. And then one summer in college, I hitchhiked out to California, worked on the ranch.
Right. Now, I think you've already told us that as a result of your basketball career at BGA, that you got some type of sports scholarship to Vanderbilt.
It was a half scholarship. My father was an adjunct professor. He had a private practice, but he also taught at the medical school, which allowed me to come in free anyway, but they gave me a half scholarship, which lasted 1 year.
Tell us about the experience back then and who you played basketball with.
Actually, I played on a freshman team. At the time, the varsity was number 8 in the nation, and came in second in the SEC. Unfortunately, back then, could not go to the NCAA tournament. Some of the freshmen got to sit and play a few minutes with the varsity. It wasn't like it is today, when freshmen one and done. Back then, the freshmen had to make it academically more than been able to play. But on my freshman team, we had I was the 6th man. I wasn't a starter except out of town. For some reason, I started every game at guard out of town, but none here. Freshman team, we had a guy named Larry Ramey, who was our best scorer. He ended up being a little All-American at Butler. He transferred to Butler. Jack Peary was on that team. Jack Peary was a high school All-American, and he played on the varsity that year and following year. And Ben Rowan was our center, and he also played out later. I got asked out. Long story. I did not stay.
You know, was the coach of the varsity team at that time Bob Polk?
Bob Polk.
He's a legend.
He was. Jack Hellman was the freshman coach.
Did Al Rochelle and Bobby Tim, were they playing at that time?
They were on the varsity. Doug Henry, and I think it was, and Charlie Harrison. They were pretty good. Bobby Tim gave me a scar on my right eye to remember with a good elbow in practice today.
Well, that's a good person to give you a scar.
I have to say, our freshman team played most of the junior colleges and other smaller colleges. And we only lost one game. We were 11-1. And we lost, the game we lost to was to Roy Skinner in Paducah Junior College. Yeah. He later came the very next year to.
Absolutely. Was a top-notch coach at Vanderbilt for years. Tell us a little bit about Vanderbilt, the things that you did or the things you took part in, how that went.
Well, I majored in political science. Actually, I started out in pre-med and did not do so well. I dropped out and went into the Army Reserve along with 4 other Civic kind of fraternity brothers. And came back, studied a little bit harder, decided not to play basketball. I wouldn't be on the bench anyway. I realized that pretty quickly. Anyway, I was a member of fraternity.
And your class was Ben Rowan in your class also.
Right.
Now, he became a well-known Nashville lawyer. I think he's now retired. Anyone else that you went to school at Vanderbilt with who became members of our bar?
Russell Morris, who's deceased. He was a quarterback for Vanderbilt. You remember that?
I didn't remember that. He was
not
at
too many. Vanderbilt Law School was pretty much national.
Yeah.
And I say someone who went to law school with me, but not grad school.
As you got into your junior or senior year at Vanderbilt, how did you sort of make a decision about law school? What led you to that?
Well, that was interesting. I graduated from Vanderbilt and took a job in Seattle, Washington. And I tried to put the time frame, but I got through early. I was a 4.5-year student. I got through early, took a job in Seattle, and being in the Army Reserve, I was. They started calling up the reservists for the Cuban crisis, and I was in a control group, that is a loose group that they were calling them, and I had to either join a unit or get drafted, and I was not happy as a banker. I had to clock in at 8 o'clock and out at 4 with a card, and it just wasn't my bag. So I applied to the University of Washington Law School and also to Vanderbilt Law School, and decided to join a reserve unit in Seattle or Nashville to keep from being drafted, or if I would go to make long story short. I couldn't get into the University of Washington Law School, but I did get into Vanderbilt Law School, so I came back. That's the story I've been here ever since. Joined a reserve unit, and actually I technically got called up, but because I joined the unit, they say they have to go on active duty as a private.
And what were your years, Judge, at Vanderbilt Law School over the years?
61 through 64.
Okay.
Well, 62, 63, 64.
Give us a few minutes and tell us about what Vandy Law School was like back at that time, the teachers that you thought were outstanding.
Well, the first year was in the Kirkland Tower right at the top. There was no law school building, as you see now. And so this new school was being built, and the second year we went into the law school. So my last 2 years were at the new law school. There was professors that I remember very well. My favorite professor was Eddie Morgan, famous evidence professor. In fact, he has a book called Morgan on Evidence.
Exactly.
Is well known. He came from Harvard. Harvard had a mandatory retirement at age 65. So he and another great professor named Cheatham came from Harvard. So the faculty was outstanding. But I do remember him because he came into class and he looked around and he said, you know, I don't give tests and I don't take roll. And it was the most prepared and attended class in my whole time in law school. And he would sit down and just lecture.
He was that good, in other words, that he didn't have to take roll. People were going to be there. Gosh, he was not there by the time I got there. Wish he had been. How did you do in law school?
I would say I was in the lower fourth.
What, as you got close to, I guess it was 64 when you were going to graduate from law school, what did you decide to do?
Well, interesting fact that during law school, I was a stockbroker. I worked for Mass Investment Company
While you were going to
when I
law
was
school?
going to law school. Which may have something to do with it. I was torn between investments in the investment world. I haven't been a certified stockbroker and actually active in it. Went to school, didn't really know, but that's what I did off hours and tried to study at the same time, which explains probably why I finished it, hopefully, in the bottom four. So I decided to go into law. So I applied for different jobs. I took a job in Franklin, Tennessee with a firm called Mack Williams and Barry, which was also the Dearborn firm here in Nashville. They were satellites.
Exactly. And, who was the Barry?
Swisberry.
That's what I thought. That's
You
what I
probably know
thought.
both his sons. Yeah.
Well-known attorney, and I know his son well.
Yeah.
And tell us about how that went, your first foray in practice.
Well, it went very well. One thing I remember vividly while I was in Franklin, I didn't have that big a practice, and so it encouraged me to work with other lawyers if I could, or do things on my own. And there's a lawyer named Dave Alexander, who was a famous criminal lawyer in Franklin, and he asked me to help him with a murder case, and I did. And I actually investigated, interviewed the witness, and during the trial, in the old Franklin courthouse, the judge did not like Dave Alexander, mainly because he used to win all the time. And he was ready for the final argument in the case. And at halftime, he started having heart palpitations. And he went up to the judge and said, "Can I have a day recess? I need to go to the hospital." And the judge said, "No, this jury's here. It's final argument. And you have this associate with you, Hamilton Gayden over here, and he can argue the case." Well, I have never argued a case, even in judge session. This is like the fourth year at law school. My first case was arguing to jury on a murder case. I'll never forget that. And it helped me be brave, at least in front of every judge. I'm not sure what I did.
Absolutely. You didn't realize you could do it, and you did.
And Dave Alexander said that you argue to the jury that his wife, who was in the galley, was pregnant, and you're going to deny this child a father, just every chance you get. So I had this incoherent argument, which is printed in a little book later on. It had nothing to do with anything about innocence in every paragraph. And look at his wife; she's pregnant over here. Anyway, it was something. From that point on, I wasn't afraid much of anything.
Your Honor, did you have a period of time when you also clerked some for my old law firm, Hooker, Keeble, Dodson, and
I
Harris?
did one summer, and then also I did some research on the Atlanta plane crash, and Mr. Hooker Senior was thinking about taking.
Was that the Lockerbie, Scotland,
Right.
terrible
Yeah.
plane crash that was, I think, was a result of terrorism?
Yeah. But anyway, I did research for him for that, but then I also worked at the firm, and I forgot that you were there. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
if you were there during that period of time.
I think that I was. I think I just was joining up at the firm probably when that was happening.
I remember Tyra and Harlan. And
Oh, wonderful
Kelly.
lawyers.
Johnny Kelly, and just a really great guy.
Following those steps, I believe that you went to Dearborn and Ewing for a while.
Well, that was the same firm.
Oh,
So,
okay, the
but,
same
yeah,
one.
Bobby Warner, and I ended up doing a lot of work there. And then, by happen chance, I got a phone call, and long story short, I became a member of the first Metro Legal Department. And I am the only surviving member. Gilmer had recently passed away. We were the only two surviving members of the first Metro Legal Department.
Was Gil Merritt the director at that
Assistant
time?
director,
The assistant. Who was the first director?
Neil Brown.
Yes. Well, that's an important part of history because I had forgotten that. And I guess Metro was reasonably new. So it was an exciting period.
Was
Anything Well, tell us a little bit about the work you did at the legal department.
It was varied. I represented the Fair Board, which was interesting. It's different now. The Fair Board had Mayor Beverly Briley, man that made chief whip, and a few of the other big backers of Metro, and they made a lot of decisions, which even to this day I'm under sick not to talk about. It was not different. It was different for it. The Fair Board was the center. I took notes most of the time. Not very few legal opinions, but just taking notes. And I represent the tax collecting for the city. Also, property. I did the first auction off of the tax property in Davis County.
Is that right? Wow, that's an exciting period of time. About how long were you with the Metro Legal Department? It would have, I guess, begun about 1965.
No, I was with Metro. See, I was 65 to 67. I think it began in 64. Yeah. And I wasn't there for the first day of Metro, but within the first year. So I was there 2.5 years, 2 years and 7 months.
After that stint, Your Honor, where did you go to practice?
I went with Hofstetter and Hofstetter.
Oscar Hofstetter.
Very good.
He was.
And I was
Very definite man.
Yeah, he was a very close friend of V.B. Gullett.
That's right. Mr. Gullett at that time, I think, was largely retired, but he still came to the office every day at Hooker Keeble. He still came in, but he really was largely retired. What was that like, and how did it go in working with Oscar Hofstetter's firm and also doing some work, I guess, with Hooker Keeble firm?
Actually, there's no work with Hooker Keeble after that clerkship, but I enjoyed Hofstetter. Hofstetter had a general practice. Did a little bit of everything toward. I had 2 insurance companies, Republic Vanguard locally that I represented, and Mutual Tennessee.
Right.
Carrier.
Now, am I correct that we are approaching now the period when you sort of began your judgeships?
Then I left that firm and went with Smith and Cantrell. Ben Cantrell and Grant Smith worked for them a while, and I returned back to Hofstetter and Hofstetter later.
How did the whole question of your becoming a judge begin? What's the story on that? Because there's got to be a good story there.
We'll get it right out on the table. I grew up a Democrat. My father was a vociferous Democrat. Switched to be a Republican thanks to Howard Baker. I was in his campaign when I was in Franklin. And so I became mentioned president of the Young Republican Club here in Nashville, which had 400 and some members. It's the biggest Young Republican club in the state and in the United States, supposedly. Then I became campaign manager for Winfield Dunn for Davidson County, who I met at an inauguration one I've ever been to for Richard Nixon. So that's all that on the table. And so Winfield Dunn took me in, and eventually I got appointed to Joint Sessions Court. Back then, the governor did that.
That's quite a story. But did you have to you then had to run in what's largely a Democratic county. So how did you maneuver that?
It was easy. I was going to run as a Republican. Went down to the state headquarters, and I can tell you this because he confessed all that. And the chairman of the state Republican Party was George Oldham. And George Oldham said, "We're not interested in your race. Don't come back here." I was actually looking for names for contribution. My biggest backer was Jack Massey, because I used to work for him.
Yes.
Massey Investment. He said, "You're going to have $100,000 to even come close to being a Democrat." Back then, there was Bill Higgins was talking about running against me. I don't think I could have beaten him, but I was going to try. But when I got that message directly from George Oldham not to come here, and unfortunately to this day, I have to say, there's not a lot of interest in local Republicans. I see one person qualified as judge coming up. And so I decided to run as a Democrat and tell the Democrats my past, just like I'm telling you, and I did, and they took me on.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
And then it was an anomaly in a way, but you were always successful and had no trouble getting reelected. I think that's a fascinating story. Tell us, take a minute now and take us back to this period of time when you began as a general sessions judge, and who was on the bench at that time, and what it was like.
Well, there was Gail Robinson, of course, and Randall Wyatt. Well, my good friend Randall, he and I went together all the way up through the trial courts too. Les Mandela came a little bit later on. And I'm sure I'm missing names, so I won't talk about too many, but it was fun. It was actually been a jury sessions judge for 4 years compared to being a circuit judge for 43. It is totally different. But as a general sessions judge, you have more of an opportunity to actually connect with people. As a trial judge, you're more of a referee type thing. You don't take sides, but as a general sessions judge, you can interject into the case and try to help people. So I miss that part of being a general sessions judge.
Were the dockets anything at that time like they are today? Were they huge dockets?
You know, that's an interesting question, because after I became a circuit judge, I volunteered to sit as a general sessions judge at times for general sessions judges. And between the time I left and the time I started volunteering, drugs was a predominant foundation of all the criminal type cases. I mean, drugs
Yes.
permeated. Suddenly, it just was kind of an overnight thing.
Well, that was happening as I was beginning in the bar, and I remember how the sessions court docket just seemed always to get larger and larger. And so you had to have more judges and more people manning those courts. What happened after or during your 4th year as a general sessions judge that led to your eventually becoming a circuit judge?
Well, unfortunately, Bill Rutherford, who was first circuit judge, had a heart attack and passed away, bless his heart. And I used to sit at a round table at the Stallman building with a bunch of old lawyers, including Elkin Garfield.
Were you a member of the round table at the
Occasionally,
Stallman building?
occasionally.
Okay.
So I wasn't, I wouldn't be called a permanent member, but Elkin Garfield and I were friends, and just out of the blue, he said, you know, this opening judge, the judge died, and they cannot have a popular election. And I don't think anybody realized it. He didn't elect law very well. So that it's going to be the Democratic Executive Committee is going to appoint the Democratic nominee for this job. And so I went to work and ended up getting 47 votes on the first ballot. There were like eight people running: George Linebaugh, Harry Lester, Bill Higgins.
So you got the appointment.
I got the vote.
Wow. At that time, you mentioned something that I had forgotten, to tell you the truth, but it was a very famous thing, the Stallman Building group that met for coffee at the Stallman Building. Tell us a little bit about who was in that group and what that was all about.
Well, Elkin Garfield was there. Wilson West was one of them. That's occasionally they allowed Charlie Garfield to come in.
Right? Right. Dan Garfinkel.
Dan Garfield was one of them. Yeah.
I knew Dan well.
I pictured faces, but the older lawyers, you know.
Well, if you wanted to be kind of knowledgeable in the courthouse and what was happening day to day, that was a good place to visit because everything got discussed. So you received the vote by the Democratic committee to run for judge. Is that correct? And what happened?
Well, let me back up a little bit. Actually, there's another story to that too. I had a friend who's very close to Governor Plant, whom I've never met to this day. And he called me up and he said, you know, Bill, talking about Bill Rutherford died. I was a general sessions judge. He said, "You want to go after that job?" I said, Governor Bland's looking for somebody to appoint, and I know him very well, and I can get that appointment. And, so I thought about it. I thought about it. I said, well, this is about the time we go to plan for reputation. I'd rather do it the way I did it on the executive committee, which I did anyway, but
Right.
I wasn't going to take an early appointment. So I called him back and I said, no. And he said, well, do you have any ideas who the governor might appoint? At the time, I sat on the board of Mutual Tennessee along with several other people. And one of them was Bob Lillard. And Bob Lillard and I are very close friends from that relationship. And I heard he was retiring, so I called Bob up. I said, Bob, would you like to be a judge for 5 months? That's what it was. First circuit judge. He said, that sounds like a fun thing to do. So I called this particular person who knew Blanton and told him about that. And he called Blanton as the story goes. Blanton said, well, I know Bob Lillard. He called Bob Lillard up and I said, Bob Lillard got to be a judge for 5 months.
And am I correct that is really sort of a historic moment? Because was Bob Lillard the first person of color to sit on the bench?
Exactly. Yeah. And he deserved the honor. Yeah.
And
his portrait's in the First Circuit courthouse right now.
bless your heart for saying, I'd rather run for it and let somebody else have it for a few months, because that was historic. Tell us what it was like. Was it about 78 now that you began as a circuit court judge? Was it 1978?
Correct.
Give us a picture of what your life was like, what your docket was like.
Well, it was totally different. One of the things I didn't anticipate, I knew about it, didn't know the depth of it. That was that Bill Rutherford tried 1/3 of all the domestic relations cases, divorces, custody, contempt, everything they go. And that was pretty much a shock, having to decide as one person, custody cases, divorce cases, a very heavy load.
I can only imagine.
And the trial part of it wasn't that hard because I had been a trial lawyer before I got appointed. But the divorce, and then also, as later happened, I became the committal judge for all Middle Tennessee, 33 counties, at a Middle Tennessee Health, Vanderbilt.
So, who else was a circuit judge when you first came on the bench?
It was Joe Loser.
Okay.
Jim Swigert. I think
Sixth Circuit was.
George was the first circuit judge.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember myself, but
Senior Miller, the divorce judge, one judge, and other 2/3 of the right.
Who was Third Circuit at that time? I'm trying to remember his name. He passed away very quickly after that, but real good guy, kind of a younger gentleman. I can't remember right now, but it was. So did you have the commitment docket in your court?
Well, I jumped ahead. So I tried divorce cases for about 4 years. 30 of the divorce cases. And honestly, I was considering not running again because I admire Judge Smith and Judge Robinson. It's a hard load to decide custody cases and those kind of things, and I just didn't like it.
Exactly.
I always liked it. So one day Joe Losa came to the office and he started talking to me and said, I hear tell that you're not real happy about all these divorce cases. He said, I don't blame you. He said, I'll tell you what, I'll make a swap with you. If you'll take over all the committal cases, which each one of the judges did on this rotating basis, all 4 of us, and then we'll divide divorce cases like that, rotate a third of the divorce cases.
Well, that would take that load off of you, but you would take, you'd take the committal docket, and this is the folks with the mental health problems.
So I said, you just win yourself a committal judge. And I was doing that as the only judge until about 6 years ago. And Judge Trimmer was the divorce judge. Yeah, that's in trouble.
Did Judge Kurtz for a while share some of that docket with you?
Judge Kurtz, I did it totally. Judge Kurtz came in as presiding judge, and he also liked to do that. So that's when we started rotating, except I did all of Vanderbilt, still did until the day I left. Farthon Pavilion, VA Hospital, but the local communal hospital, Middle Tennessee Health was rotating. So I didn't want to do that. I wanted to actually, I said, okay.
You got out of the courthouse, I think, on many occasions to have these hearings.
So in T-Berry Institute, I did all those as opposed to have to get out using dangerous prisoners, murderers, that kind of thing.
Right.
They're mentally ill, I would have the hearing of the T-Berry. But now they do it by video.
You know, these, to me, that's got to be a tough docket, but apparently you thought it was something that needed to be done, and you'd rather do that than make decisions about custody and things like that.
I guess maybe even Joe Lotion said, I understand you wanted to be a doctor and didn't make it at Vanderbilt. And there was this opening shot. So there was my contact with the medical community.
Back in that time, I recall something about a lawsuit filed by John J. Hooker about judicial retention. Was that your case? Tell us about that lawsuit and what was happening, or what he wanted to happen.
He filed a lawsuit asking that the Judicial Retention Committee be declared unconstitutional. And as an example, he put up the committee's tentative disallowance of 2 appellate judges to be approved, meaning they would have to run in a free election. And well, both are still on the bench, by the way. One of them was, I believe, Judge McCollum from West Tennessee on the criminal bench, and judge here in Nashville. But that's not important. But I didn't. I think I look back on my notes. I didn't make a specific ruling. I just said this is a violation of the Equal Protection Act because on the committee, as it was supposed to be important, it was supposed to be an exemplary of the Tennessee population, both as a gender and sex. On the committee, there were 2 women, 9 men. I might get the figures wrong. 1 black person and 1 Hispanic person. And it said it's composed incorrectly. That 4 were to be chosen by the Speaker of the Senate and 4 by the Speaker of the House. Beth Harwell, bless her heart, did appoint the 2 women and 2 men, but the Speaker of the Senate, all men. And so I said that it's a violation of Equal Protection Act right off the surface. So the committee met and changed their mind on these 2 judges, which I'm glad. Then I dismissed Hooker's lawsuit, then he filed another one. And they came to my court because that's our system. When you file one court, you have to stay in that court. And he said that you don't recuse yourself, and we'll do this and do that. And so I refused to recuse myself. The next thing I know, he was going to run against me for judge. It wasn't hard. I mean, his daughter clerked for me, by the way.
That's John J. Hooker Jr.
Yeah. That's senior. But, so I had my contacts with John Hooker Jr. unpleasantly, but which is too bad because it's pleasantly before that.
You know, thinking back, there are several cases that you're sort of received a high profile for because they ended up in your court. And one that I remember had to do with an accident at Opry Land that was very much in the newspapers. Tell us about that.
That was a case where a little boy, one of the BB gun or whatever.
Pellet guns.
Yeah. Pellet gun got hit with one of the pellet guns, turned sideways and discharged and hit him in the head. It was a serious case. We had a 6-person jury. Interested enough to get a 6-person jury now, it's like pulling teeth. We did it several times back then. This 6-person jury tried it over a period of, I think, 3 months. That was the ball case.
3 months?
3 months, 2 to 3 months. We actually had here until Saturday. 2 or 3 Saturdays we had these Jews come in. And maybe hyperbole, probably maybe 2 months on
Who was involved in that case? Do you recall?
it. Yeah,
Your Honor?
I refresh my memory. Tom Higgins was representing the plaintiff.
And Charlie Baker, I
Charlie
think.
Baker was involved in it. And I can't remember the defense was. But it was a big judgment. At that time, one of the biggest judgments, it's over $1 million.
Yeah, one of the biggest judgments at that time in Nashville judicial history.
And the footnote to that is Tom Higgins is probably the best trial lawyer, other than maybe Johnny Connors. Those two I put right at the top.
The well-known country music singer George Jones had a case in your court. Tell us about that.
Well, that was a fight over both with his ex-wife, ex-wife, and make a long story short, I issued an injunction rule against them, and she gained possession of the boat. The footnote to that is actually George Jones and I became friends through West Nashville guy Jimmy. They had that restaurant down in West Nashville, great friend of his, and he had a party, asked me to it. I said, "Let's go kill me," and sure enough, we became friends, George Jones and I.
How about that? And that dispute, I guess, was with Tammy Wynette because they were married at one time. May have remarried, I don't recall. Well, that was another one that really made the newspapers. There was a case that had to do with the Metro Public Defender's Office and the terms of the term limits on that. What was that about?
I think my notes go that anyway. I wrote in favor of the sitting public defender, and I said that he did not have to qualify because he was an incumbent or something like that. It was a stretch of the law, but he missed a qualifying deadline. That call.
Was that early sort of in the career of the public defender's office?
Right.
Because at one time, I think the judges just looked for a young lawyer out in the gallery and said, you're going to do service as the defense of this particular defendant in criminal cases. But then that changed when we got a public defender. Well, I'm going to ask you about this case. That was the famous case of the Peeping Tom with the famous Aaron Andrews, the TV reporter. What was that about?
Well, that was a case where she sued a hotel there for allowing a person to get into her privacy. Person faked the name, got through security, was able to film her through a they called it Jimmy, and and then put her pictures on the internet. She sued the hotel. It lasted maybe 3 weeks.
How did she make a recovery?
A huge recovery. It's unsealed, but a huge recovery.
Do you remember the lawyers involved in that? And they may have been out of town lawyers.
All out of town except Kennard Stevens. And he was good, but the out of town lawyer was terrific from California.
There was a case that had to do with MDHA condemnation of some property on the East Bank here in Nashville that made the news. Was that in your court?
Yes, it was.
Oh, tell us about that case.
Well, MDHA through Metro government condemned the property where the Titan Stadium now sits and the new stadium will sit. And it was contested. The property owners contested it based on the theory that you can't use eminent domain to take private property from public, take private property for private use. And then at the time, the law was split. There wasn't any law in Tennessee. Metro was smart enough to put one of the defense to Tennessee State University football program. They were part of it too, and that's more of a public taking public property, public use. And I heard the arguments and rode from the bench and allowed the city to condemn the property and build the stadium. And I look back on that, it was strictly a legal decision on my part. But I have to admit, I became a Titans fan after that.
It was a
Later on-
huge decision for Nashville's future.
Yeah, later, a ticket holder, and despite all the eminence about the new stadium, apparently our beloved mayor has worked it out where it's not going to be paid by taxpayers, and I kudos to Judge, to Governor Lee. He stepped in, and it's as much a state project. They're helping with this, and so it's not just for Nashville, but the state of Tennessee.
Yeah, it looks like now we're gonna get a dome stadium.
There's a lot of argument about that, but you know, there are a lot of towns that have lost professional teams, like Hartford, Connecticut, for example, lost some others. It's just not good, and this is really a part of the personality of Nashville, Tennessee Titans, and Tennessee State University football plays out there.
Another one of your, well, this is a particularly significant case for the legal and judicial profession, but you had a case that had to do with the evaluation commission, judicial evaluation commission, didn't you? Or is that, am I thinking wrong?
Well, it's the same one that we talked about before.
Okay, okay, yes.
It actually, it's sunshine. It went off books anyway by its own date.
Right. Right. That's where you got the commission because of your right to reconsider what they were going to recommend. Mount Olivet Cemetery, there was a case that had some profile in town that you handled in your court. What was that about?
Well, I had actually an appeal from Jones Sessions Court where a lady had sued Mount Olivet to get a grave marker, which she'd paid for. It had been over a year, nothing had been done. I took proof, saw pictures of grass growing up, called in the cemetery people, no justification, no written explanation. So I just said, you either get a grave marker this later within 2 weeks, or I'm gonna consider putting you into receivership to see if you're financially able to support the cemetery. And they weren't, and I appointed John Wagster as receiver. I understand it was the longest receivership in Tennessee history. It went on for 11 years, and John pulled that cemetery out of basically out of bankruptcy. And now it's survived a great historical place.
Oh, absolutely. And it's got to make you feel good to see now Mount Olivet as a thriving and ongoing cemetery here in Nashville.
And again, the heartbeat of Nashville and part of the Nashville personality is Mount Olivet.
And in our history, boy, a good deal of Nashville's history is played out. You just walk Mount Olivet and see the gravestones. Tough case having to do with the Tennessee abortion statute. And I asked you about that with some reservation, but what was that dispute about?
Well, whether or not the Tennessee law was unconstitutional, and particularly fighting the 48-hour, at that time, the 40-hour waiting period. Fighting the rule of whether parents should be notified of a teenager under 18 is seeking an abortion. And just the guts of the then law, and I ruled on particularities of the provisions. For example, I ruled that the 48-hour waiting period was unconstitutional. I ruled that parents should have some notification or judicial bypass of the teenager that is pregnant and is thinking of abortion. That I got bombed by the pro-lifers on the first one, and by the abortionists on the second one. So
Yeah, you caught it from both sides.
And actually got threatened on the telephone, threatened at a grocery store one day, and so it was a hot potato. But anyway, it was useless. It went up to the Court of Appeals, and the judge wrote the opinion. A-page opinion wrote that there was no constitutional right under our Constitution for abortion. That was appealed, and then the case that now stands, which will likely be set aside very shortly, was written that there is a constitutional right to to privacy and to abortion. But that's going to be obviously.
It will be with us for a long time yet. A lot of legal decisions being made even today about that. You know, there was some decision that I think came out of your court that dealt with the public guardianship laws. Do you recall that one?
Vaguely, the public guardian court, the probate court was sued, and I ruled that she didn't have right to claim she couldn't be sued.
Okay, in other words, she wasn't exempt from doing her duties because she had the public guardianship position. Fireworks. Something tells me that you have a fireworks case also.
Construing the Metro fireworks law, which was pretty strict, and the end result, I wrote that it was strict enough that you could not sell fireworks in Davidson County, but you could own and possess them. Next morning after I wrote that, I came out my front door, and there's this huge, I'm not kidding, a huge garbage full of every kind of firework you could possibly think of. I had two sons at the time, so I had an immediate ethical question. Fire these off, I put them in the trash can. I give the Roman candles to the neighbors. I did a lot of it, spread them out to everybody.
And then just one or two other cases that I recall were in the newspapers. Judge, didn't you have the case about a gentleman who claimed to be the world's smallest man?
I did. That's back when I tried divorce case that I mentioned earlier. And so my court officer, who was a joker, told me on Tuesday or Wednesday before Friday, or had a contempt hearing set for involving this man. They said, you're going to have the smallest man in the Vanderbilt Law Circus. He's retired, but he was the smallest man in the world on your docket Friday. I thought it was kidding. He's always joking. So I went in on Friday afternoon, and sure enough, sitting to my right at the table was a man, maybe 2 feet tall, 2.5 feet tall. His soon-to-be ex-wife, who was one of the Walendas.
Oh, really?
Yeah, beautiful.
The circus act?
Right. I'm sitting there thinking, first of all, how did this work out? But I got that out of my mind, like, good, this is surreal, like this is not a dream. But anyway, he was charged with shooting a gun at her, and so they had the police officer there, and there was a corollary criminal proceeding, but this was a contempt proceeding to keep him away from her. So the police officer testified the gun was bigger than he was almost, his old Colt 38. And so I was looking at the gun. All of a sudden, this little guy said, so like, what is this, Judge Gayden, you SOB, you can't do anything to me because I'm famous. I'm the smallest man in the world, the Vanderbilt circuit. You do anything to me, I'll have your ass on the front page of the Nashville, Tennessee. So, I don't think I've ever been talked to like that. I said, I don't care who you are, how small you are, or how big your mouth is, but one more peep out of you and we're going to see. So his wife took a stand later, and she started testifying. And I asked her a question from the bench, and he went bananas. He said, Judge Gayden, you don't have right to get this case. I told you, you do anything to me, I'll have your ass on the front page of the name. I said, well, I'll tell you what, we're going to find out because you're going to jail for 10 days. Haul him away. So they took him away. The next morning, my wife said, you better get down here and read this to us in the local page. The lead story was a picture of Faye Thomas, this guy in a baby high chair, and a nurse on the side who's eating a steak, and had judge put smallest man in the world in jail. And I'll tell you what, it was the hardest political fight in my life to get over that. It took me a year. It took me a year to even speak to Faye. He was a friend of mine. He got a big kick out of it. So the answer to that is be aware of small packages.
One of the things that I recall from, I think several years ago, was that you had a witness box on wheels that you used in your courtroom. What was that about?
I did bring the first witness box on wheels into the courthouse along with the Bibles in every courtroom. And the reason for that is actually B.B. Gully and O.B. Hofstetter arranged for a private seminar with a famous English lawyer comparable to Jim Neal, His name was Victor Duran. So I went over and spent a week in Oak Bailey with Victor Duran. And he was in the middle of trying.
This was in England.
Yeah, in England. The biggest trial, fraud trial in English history since then. There have been many more, but it was a Murdoch trial. Anyway, he'd take me into where the lawyers would meet for lunch after killing each other in the courtroom and drinking together. It's an interesting whole bar situation. It's so different from ours. The civility is much greater than it is ours. But he pointed out to me that a couple of things. There was never a Bible. He came to Nashville, went around some of the courts, and that the trial of fact never faced the judge or the jury. It's always to the left. And it's so unusual. And if you look at in kind of a movie about English trials, you'll see the defendant or the witnesses are facing the jury. If it's a judge trial, they're facing the judge. So that's when I decided to get a box that you could have them facing the jury or facing me as a judge. When the courthouse was shut down for the refurbishing due to the air in the courthouse, my jury box was put into storage and I never saw it again. I know where it is, by the way. I never got it.
But your idea was that a witness ought to be facing the jury so the jury can really size up what they think about credibility.
Right, or the judge if it's a non-jury trial. The other thing was in England, I don't know if they do it now, but when you were sworn as a witness, you held the Bible in your hand, and you had to swear to tell the truth, nothing to do. Their versions do swear. They're kind of over, but he, Victor Rand, maintains that the way of that Bible sometimes makes a big difference in somebody before they get up there and tell a lie. So I had a Bible for a long time. I kind of let that go.
Right.
After a while.
Right. Well, you mentioned something that leads me to a topic I'm glad you reminded me of it. And that has to do with the courthouse itself. And I had not realized this till I talked with you before our interview. But I think you had a big part in the entire renovation of the Metropolitan Government Courthouse. Tell us about that and why you were involved.
Well, the courthouse was shut down, I think probably in 1998, so right that period of time. I was involved in it because I noticed the air in the courthouse, and particularly in my courtroom and in my office was terrible. And I even had bought machines. I even had an article in the Sun pulling out the filter of the air in my office, which was caked with dust, debris, whatever. And so when I got to be presiding judge in 1996, I went to Mayor Bredesen and finally got a $10,000 budget item in the judge's item to get a study of the air in the courthouse. Most people saying this judge Gayden know because he's been about this.
Yeah, in other words, you sensed that the air quality was really poor.
So there was an in-depth study, and it came back. In fact, calculated with the administrative office of the court, States County, if you want to read it. But the bottom line is, not only was it dangerous, it had signs and actual asbestos part of it was in the air. And friable asbestos on the floor down in the courthouse had never been sitting on the floor.
Yeah.
And they recommended the courthouse be closed immediately. And Judge Mayor Purcell then became mayor. And I'm not sure whether it's closed down in the Bredesen, later Purcell. And he'll tell you, Purcell will tell you, this particular study was the catalyst. I said, out of here, they closed it down and tried to decide when to tear it down. Or go into the walls to get all the asbestos out, all the pipes, all. And it took them 4 years, but that's what they did.
Yeah, I remember those years when you always knew there was work going on and parts of the courthouse might not be accessible at all times. But the study that you insisted on led to sort of an entire renovation.
I can say that, but better get Mayor Purcell. He's recognized me a couple of times. But I'm sure it was, and I don't know why there wasn't any follow-up on one of my places, but I had two of my employees that got cancer. I don't know if it's directly related, and I myself have cancer survived. And so that was after the fact, but two of them during that period of time, I think something's wrong here. One of them,
Was there any work done during that period of time with the exterior of the courthouse? That is the.
oh yeah, that was nothing I had to do with Mayor Purcell. Took the reins and decided not only to do the courthouse over, but do the in front of the courthouse, which was dilapidated buildings. Our Parker had an office there, and so they condemned all the property in front of the courthouse, and that park is there, and they built a underground parking lot, and it received several architectural awards that Mayor Purcell was able to receive. And that's one of these deals. He said, "This guy right here is appointed me responsible for all this stuff." But it was a great renovation of the courthouse. They preserved the courthouse, and now you can park underneath it. Right.
But apparently, if your recollection is correct, there was also some consideration given to just taking the courthouse down to ground level and redoing it all.
Right. They decided to take on the task of removing asbestos out of all the walls around the pipes and purpose courthouse.
For a period of time, and I know this may be a small item to you, but I think it's important historically. Didn't you serve on the Tennessee Department of Labor Unemployment Compensation Board?
I did. Went into private practice from 1971 through 1974 as an appointed judge. But Winfield Dunn appointed me to the Board of Review. And Tom Binkley was the chairman of it. Remember Tom Binkley? Right. Great guy. And Elmer Davies was on it for a while.
Was Tom Binkley, what court was he?
No, he wasn't Judge Binkley. Tom Binkley was in private practice.
Okay, all right.
I think before President Nashville.
Great guy. Now I know who you're talking about. I do. Your Honor, gosh, you've spent so many years on the bench here in Davidson County. Are there any outstanding attorneys that appeared before you that you think are worthy of note, that impressed you as just being outstanding representatives for their clients?
Oh yeah, I'm sure there are many. But as I mentioned, Tom Higgins, in the old day, Connors,
John Connors.
Randy Kennard.
Now, what was Randy known for? Was he mostly in malpractice?
Well, he's malpractice plaintiff's lawyer, a man of great perseverance. And I think he used to run 10 miles a day or something like that. Well, that's the way he practiced law. And his entire firm, all those lawyers in that firm, Mark Beveridge, and Gareth Layden.
Well, I don't know if I'm in that category, but I know that the people you mentioned were outstanding attorneys. Did Jim Neal ever practice in the court?
I'm sorry.
Jim Neal.
I don't remember what he ever been in my court. Of course, Jim Neal is a superstar. I forgot about him.
What about judges? Are there any judges that during your career you thought were outstanding or impressed you or helped you in your job?
Well, yeah, at Birch, we'd be at the top of us. We served together all the way through until he became Court of Appeals judge and then on the Supreme Court. His son clerk for me for one summer that. And his son was a Harvard graduate, and Frank DeWater, a personal friend of mine. I'd say he was a star. Ben Cantrell, practiced law with him.
Exactly, and Ben served not only on the courts of record in Tennessee, I mean in Davidson County, but I think he went on to the Tennessee Court of Appeals also.
He did. He is the only Republican ever to be elected to local office since the Civil War. And I got him in the Winfield Dunn campaign. And that's how I got to be a circuit, chancellor. But he ran against a guy. I almost beat him. The guy I almost beat him was Stan Siddiquen, who was in the process of being disbarred, which shows you it's tough for Republicans to win. But Ben Cantrell did it.
Let's talk for a minute while we're here together talking about history and things in the community that you have done. I know you have some history with the Boy Scouts. Tell us a little bit about that and how it happened.
Well, I had two sons in Scouts. That's the easiest way to get into it. I was a Scout myself. Troop 1.
Really?
Billy Jim Vaughn.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember Billy Jim.
Name? Oh, absolutely. Famous. True.
Louis Todd, whose son now is a judge, Jim Todd, was assistant Scout master. Then my sons were members of St. George's Episcopal Church at the time. So that was where I got into Scout, became kind of a assistant Scout master.
Well, that's another big troop that's been very successful at St. George's.
And then I got interested in scouting in general. I was head of SMA, good work for raising money for Explorer Scouts for 1 year. And I was on the advisory board at one time.
That's what I thought, that you had served on the advisory board for the district or council here in Nashville. I think you did some work for the Red Cross too. I don't want you to brag on yourself too much, but tell us about your service there.
Well, the Red Cross, I received a special medal from them, but I would give defendants at General Sessions Court an alternative to going to jail or something, or paying a fine. In addition to that, I gave them money on marriages that I did.
People don't all know this, but as an interesting adjunct to your life and career, I believe you wrote a novel.
I wrote two novels that have been published both times.
Take a minute and tell us what they were and what they were about.
They're totally unrelated, but the first one was called The Circle of the Cross. And that relates to the fact that having been a Vietnam era veteran, and having a first cousin in-law a lot closer to him than it was my cousin. He was shot down and was in prison for war for 5 years. He came back. He's now deceased. Became a doctor, by the way. He convinced me that our country left in Vietnam kept American POWs behind, a lot of them. He had some good proof. Long story short, because then I wrote a book based on a fictional character who was one of these POWs who came back secretly, which drew a lot of attention. And I intended to include the FBI testifying from the U.S. Senate MI POW committee.
I didn't know that.
I still have an interest in that. It's a dark history, a dark story in our history, and even relates today with the Soviet Union back then, also keeping prisoners behind.
Yeah, it has a lot of relevance to some things that are happening in the world right now that we're just kind of finding out about. People being buried and nobody even knows that they were buried until somebody found them.
I can sit here for a full day to tell you about the experiences I have with that book. Anyway, the second book was totally related. It was based on a true murder story that happened here in Nashville and in Gallatin, Summit County. And that was called Miscarriage of Justice. It had to do with a killing The theme of that book was men understanding women, and all man jury in this murder case. And actually, the book, if you look up Amazon, a signed copy of that book sells for over $40, and hard copy for over $25. And then it's about a little paperbacks and that kind of thing. But that was a Hachette published that book.
Good for you. That's quite a distinction to have done that.
It was rated the #1 book in Nashville in 2012. Bestseller.
Today, as you and I sit here, and you're now retired after a long career serving the judiciary and the people of Tennessee, what are you doing these days? Anything that you'd like to mention?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, trying to decide where we're going to live. My wife and I have a daughter and a granddaughter living in Dallas, Texas. And we actually have a little place down there, and we have our place. So we're going through the decision, renting, selling, and those kind of things. But as far as I do every day, I do have 2 manuscripts that I've worked on. I don't know if I'll get them published. It's been very difficult, I might add, to do that compared to 2012. Totally different market. And so I do that, but it keeps me busy. I also like to learn to speak a second language, so I'm concentrating on Spanish.
Wow.
And I have also applied to be certified as a mediator. And so I'm waiting to hear from that. And so I'm trying to decide what I'm going to do when I grow up. Whether I'm going to be a mediator.
I believe your career qualifies you to be a mediator.
I did have to tell you, I did tentatively try to get a Texas law license about 4 years ago, thinking that I might end up going to Texas. And then the rules have changed. So to get a Texas law license now, you have to pass the multi-state, no matter who you are. And you have to make a higher grade than the minimum, I think it's 270. And that's intimidating. And that is really intimidating. And I would have to study for the bar, it just seems so far away. So that's going to kind of decide.
Have you been traveling any, or do you have any plans for you and your wife to travel?
Well, not much. We're actually well traveled. We've been to China twice, been to Europe 3 times, been to South America, Argentina, Costa Rica. So we're probably put our travel time in with this pandemic and still threats of it, and the fact that things have been closed down. I'd like to go to Ireland. It's on my bucket list.
I'll second that. That's a place that I have not been either. And I have friends who've been and say it's just delightful.
You have an Irish name, don't you? It sounds like it.
Well, it's more Scottish, really. Yeah, it's more Scottish. It was from the Islands of the King. Tell us about your thoughts before we finish. Before we start at the end, but you've had a long and interesting and distinguished career at the law and in the judiciary. Any reflections you have about where practice or the judiciary lawyering is going and what changes for the good or the bad that you see?
Well, as an overview, maybe picking little things. One of them is the cost of litigation. I had good experience. I had an automobile accident in Chicago going to my son's graduate from Northwestern, and I got hurt, and so I had to sue in Chicago, and they actually made me settle. It was just again so ridiculous having to go up and give depositions and this and that. So I learned the hard way, and so I look at people that have to have their rights in front of a jury, and the use of depositions and cost is just incredible. I don't know how to answer that. It's just, and of course, for the technology advances, the discovery of e-discovery, and that's a wild card.
That is a real wild card because it's really become a big part of litigation practice. It is the broad range of documents and records and computer records that you can obtain.
So, our judicial system has got to open its doors somehow and learn how to refine that. And that's one thing. The other thing is politics and the judiciary, not only the federal level, as we're saying, at the Supreme Court level, but everywhere. Just going back to England and France, when I went to another tour of French judges, the judges there are, and by and large, I saw were very open-minded, fair. You know, they were influenced. Some to a degree I noticed became loners, especially in France. And then I'll tell you that judges don't have any friends in France. But here it's just it's kind of commingled. The judiciary and politics. It's got to be separated.
My impression has been that that is a thing to really to worry about in the country. I do think that I'd like your opinion about this, that we're very lucky in Nashville, Davidson County to have a bar association and a bar that generally works and generally keeps lawyers congenial and meeting together. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think so. Nashville, compared to other cities I've seen, we've kind of kept ourselves. Even our judges are somewhat under attack by the state legislature and the governors, and we're homages. We do our thing. And yeah, Nashville, a great town. The Judge Swigert, you mentioned that. I think of Judge Swigert all the time. He's just a great judge, open-minded. His relation with lawyers. Yeah, I think Nashville's done a good job of that.
Any other thoughts that you'd like to share, or have we covered things pretty well?
Well, pretty well. I probably will remember things that I could remember. I'm trying to remember that public defender. I don't think I said it was a qualified deadline, but I can't. I have to go back and see. So yeah, I saw an exception to law that kept him in office.
Well, let me say before we end that the Bar Association appreciates not only your career, but you're spending the time giving us this oral history. Thank you very much, Your Honor.
Appreciate you asking.
Take care now.
Okay.